Hello, I'm Judd, and I'm a manager in Westwood's hydrogen team, and I want to welcome you to our first Hydrogen Compass deep dive, where we will focus on a major trend or major movement in the European hydrogen market. This episode, I'm joined by my colleague Arthur.
Hi, I'm Arthur, and for the last 2 years, I've been an analyst in Westwood's hydrogen team.
Thanks, Arthur.
So today we're going to focus on a potentially major roadblock for Europe's hydrogen future, and that's the non-implementation of RED III, which is a key EU hydrogen directive for the mandated use of renewable hydrogen. We're also going to cover the broader implications this has for project pipelines, investor confidence, and demand creation.
Yeah, so RED III, which stands for the Renewable Energy Directive, that was put forward to be a key lever of Europe's hydrogen demand, and it set targets like, of course, 42% renewable hydrogen use in industry and a 1% renewable hydrogen use in transport, both by 2030. But so far, as of today, no EU country has actually fully transposed this directive into national law, and this is a legal step which is crucial for turning the policy into real action.
And it's been a pretty long journey, I would say, for the implementation of this directive into national law. You know, the initial RED III was passed by the EU in October 2023, so it's been, 18 months plus since that happened, and a crucial deadline for that implementation in each country has already passed, hasn't it?
Yeah, it was around 2 weeks ago, the 21st of May, and we've yet to see any formal implementation. There's been some progress to date, obviously, with the Netherlands agreeing last month to a 4% renewable hydrogen mandate for industrial decarbonisation, albeit that this 4% is significantly lower, obviously, than the 42% target set by the EU. Also, I think Denmark also proposed a 0.9% renewable hydrogen in transport, which falls just shy of the 1% minimum. So yeah, it's not just about delays, but we're also seeing countries propose far weaker targets. And this raises concerns, I suppose, that RED III could be implemented perhaps just in name, but maybe not in substance.
Yeah, that's true. I guess the one counter to that would be that France did propose in May a 1.5% transport fuels mandate by 2030, which in this case does exceed the EU target of 1%. But I definitely do agree with the overall sentiment there that, generally speaking, the overall theme seems to be delays and also significantly lower targets. And also France crucially don't have a industry use target, which is clearly more ambitious or far higher than the transport one. In the Netherlands, there's also been more uncertainty. The collapse of the Dutch government puts their 2.8 billion euro subsidy package for renewable hydrogen production and the country's 4% mandate that was mentioned earlier into a potential state of political limbo.
Yeah, of course, that's right. The coalition fell apart, and while their climate minister, Sophie Hermans, remains in office for now, their green growth package, which includes those subsidies that you mentioned, this package might be scrapped or even delayed.
Yeah, that's pretty significant, especially when we look at what that means for hydrogen project realization in the EU. About a month ago, our team did publish a white paper which covers the realistic opportunities and outlook for European hydrogen production. we outlined different cases for realizing Europe's project pipeline until 2030. And in the most ambitious case, we projected up to 70%, and that's up to around 50 gigawatts in lower heating value of the current pipeline materializing by 2030, which obviously could theoretically meet the EU's 2030 production target of 40 gigawatts lower heating value. But Arthur, do you think that's 70%, do you think that's still realistic given the developments that we've seen, or I should say the lack of development in a way over the last month or so?
Well, I suppose that without the legal mandates driving demand, even our 40 to 50% scenario that we presented in the report looks quite shaky. And in our view, investors and developers and off-takers need a strong demand side and regulatory foundation. And that foundation is just not quite there yet, which is especially true for projects targeting, industrial and transport off-take cases. And in our report, we show that 72% of these types of projects lack off-takers.
Yeah, I totally agree. Without these mandates enforced, why would industry really make that switch just yet and pay the premium without these strict mandates, right?
Yeah, it's definitely a risk. Even projects that we deem as probable to reach FID could be impacted by this, as without binding demand, developers can't lock in long-term offtake contracts, and without off-takers, these projects just don't move forward. And that's why so many sit in our possible or risked categories in our certainty framework. And there doesn't appear to be any penalty for countries that don't implement either. So this raises uncertainty about the likelihood of full implementation of the RED III directive. But as we pointed out in our low-end scenario in our white paper, which results in just 17% realization of the EU's total capacity, which is still 12 gigawatts of hydrogen in lower heating value, and that's a substantial amount of production capacity, which we shouldn't forget.
Yeah, 100%. It's definitely easy to focus on negatives and challenges, but getting to gigawatt scale, which is even as Arthur said, not a low-end scenario, is pretty significant. So if we're gonna start to focus away from those negatives and challenges that we've been seeing, where from your perspective do you see progress?
Well, mainly I suppose in funding, which has seen great progress recently, with the EHB, the European Hydrogen Bank, the second auction progressing and offering 1 billion euros for 15 projects, with final contracts for these projects expected to be signed in the autumn. And there's actually a third auction coming at the end of this year, and also on top of funding, infrastructure is gaining a bit of traction as well, with the Italian backbone and the conversion of the Trans-Austria gas pipeline. They've both received grants recently, with Evonik also completing part of its hydrogen pipeline in Germany, which is connecting the Get H2 Nucleus project in Lingen. So these, funding and infrastructure, obviously very important steps to enable the European hydrogen market.
Yeah, around this topic of funding in particular, I know that Netherlands, Germany, other countries as well see subsidies as a way to fill that gap to incentivize, say, the remainder of the, in this case, the 42% industrial use target as an example. But I think, at least in my view, I'm sure Arthur, you agree, while subsidies do help, and there's plenty of subsidies coming our way, which is excellent news, of course, they can't fully substitute without being met with some sort of binding obligation on the other side. So it's great to have production side support. Obviously, a lot of these policies, a lot of funding mechanisms are sitting on that side, but we're seeing a bit of a gap towards the offtake side, the demand side. And without that, of course, investors need predictability, and voluntary uptake just doesn't provide that. However, that 42% industry use target may not be perfect. We've had industry voices, people that we speak to, saying that the 42% target is perhaps too aggressive, perhaps too ambitious, especially given the question of, again, who's going to absorb that premium. So of course you have to have both sides, as I said. You can't, again, have a functioning market without, that's based on optional commitments. You need enforceable rules, and of course you need penalties. Penalties are crucial, and I know some potential consultations by governments are exploring the idea of penalties, but that's of course still something we're waiting on. So obviously it's not a simple answer, but RED 3, in our view, isn't dead. It's still progressing slowly, albeit, but clearly at the moment it's still far from functional.
Yeah, I think it's going to be crucial to understand what will happen by the end of this year, and we'll have to take another look at our projections again at the end of the year, and hopefully we can lean more towards our upside 70% scenario